Salvete discipuli, and welcome to Latin class. Today, we're going to be learning how to determine the correct form of the relative pronoun in both English and Latin. Today, we'll learn how to decide whether to use who, whom, whose, or which, or any of the 30 forms of qui, quae, quod. I'm ready to get started. Are you? The first step for determining whether to use who, whose, whom, or which, or one of the relative pronoun forms in Latin, is to be able to determine the antecedent, because the pronoun you pick must have the same gender and number as the antecedent. You've already had lots of practice and have become experts at that. So what's next? First of all, we have to be able to find the relative clause in both English and Latin. The relative clause in English will always begin with a relative pronoun or a preposition followed by a relative pronoun. And it will end oftentimes where the end of the sentence is, but it always ends when the relative clause expresses a complete idea. So take a look at this sentence. We see the relative pronoun whom, and I see the word to in front of it. So that's where my relative clause begins, with to whom. Now let's talk about where it ends. If I make it end at the end of the sentence, then that means that everything from to whom all the way to the period is the relative clause. And the part that's left over, the farmer, should be a complete sentence, but it's not. So my relative clause ends before the end of the sentence. How do I know where? To know where the relative clause ends, I have to think about what it's communicating. The queen gave many horses to someone. So the relative clause, which begins with to whom, is going to end at horses. When I look at the words that are left over, the farmer now loves her, that expresses a complete idea. So I know I have found the complete relative clause. And that's the very first step for being able to decide whether to use who, whose, which, or what form of qui, quae, quod. In Latin, we also have to be able to tell where the relative clause begins and ends. And it's actually a lot simpler in Latin. You look for your form of qui, quae, quod. So I see qui in the Latin sentence. And then I look for the first verb, which is dated. That's where my relative clause ends. It's always going to work that way. The relative clause in Latin begins with the relative pronoun. Sometimes there's a preposition in front of it, and it will always end with the first verb that you find after the relative pronoun. Now you are ready to determine the precise form of the relative pronoun. You already know from the antecedent what the gender and number is of the pronoun. Now you need to look at the clause that the pronoun is in and determine what its use is in that sentence. This is a little more involved, but it always is going to begin by being able to find the verb in the relative clause. Let's practice. As we look at this first sentence, we were walking to the town with the servants who, whom, whose, or which were working in the fields. We must determine the antecedent of the relative pronoun, which would be the servants. Servants tells us that my pronoun must be masculine and plural. Now, what is the relative pronoun doing in the clause who, whom, whose, or which were working in the fields? I said the first thing that we need to do is find the verb, which is were working. When you read who, whom, whose, or which were working in the fields, you need to ask yourself, who is doing the working? If fields, which is a noun written in the relative clause, isn't doing the working, then that means that the relative pronoun is the subject. And subjects have to be in the nominative form. So our relative pronoun has to be masculine, plural, and nominative. Can you tell me what those forms would be in both English and in Latin? If you said who for English and qui for Latin, you are correct. Congratulations. Let's try another one. Remember that to determine the correct form of the relative pronoun, whether we're looking at English or Latin, we need to know what the antecedent is of the relative pronoun. The sentence in English says, the town, who, whom, which, or whose I saw in Italy was beautiful. What is the antecedent of the relative pronoun? Of course, it's town. Town is singular, and the Latin word for town, as well as in English, is neuter. So this means that my pronoun must be singular and neuter. Now remember that in order to decide whether we should use who, whom, whose, or which Latin form or case of the pronoun we need to use, we have to think about the relative clause itself. Who, whose, whom, or which I saw in Italy is my relative clause. Saw is the verb. Who did the seeing? I did. Well, I saw what? I didn't see Italy. I saw towns in Italy. The antecedent towns and the relative pronoun are the same. So that means that my relative pronoun is the object of saw. Do you remember what case direct objects have to be written in Latin? Of course you do. The accusative case. So that means that we have to write the neuter, accusative, singular form for the Latin, and you have to pick the right form of the English pronoun to fit in the sentence as well. Will you pick who, whom, whose, or which? Think about your answers, and then we'll see if you got them correct. The correct form of the relative pronoun in English is which, because the town is not a person, and so we do not want to use whom. In Latin, the correct form of the relative pronoun is quod, because quod is singular, neuter, and accusative. That's the case we need to make a direct object. Let's try another one together. By now, you should be getting the hang of it. We have to find the antecedent of the word that fills in the blank. Is it I or is it slaves? Here we might have to think about what the whole sentence is saying. So let's read it. I saw the slaves, who, whom, whose, or which, had been led to the city. Oh, I get it now. The antecedent is clearly, do you know? If you're shouting slaves, you are correct. The antecedent is slaves. The Latin word for slave is masculine, so that means that my pronoun form will have to be masculine and it will have to be plural because slaves is plural. Now let's think about how to get the correct Latin form of the pronoun and the correct English form of the pronoun, who, whose, whom, or which. Here we have to look at the entire relative clause. Who, whose, whom, or which had been led to the city. The verb is had been led. Well, who was being led? If you're thinking it's the slaves that had been led, you are correct. They had been led to the city. So that's the word that serves as the subject of had been led and needs to fill in the blank. Remember that subjects are nominative, so that's our case, and we get our gender and number from the antecedent. So you tell me, what will the pronoun look like in both English and in Latin? So here are the answers. The correct form of the pronoun in English is who, because remember I need the subject. And for the Latin, I will use qui. I still need the subject, which is nominative, and I have to make sure it's masculine and plural. We're going to move into Quizlet at this point and have you practice being able to get the correct form of the relative pronoun with some sentences in English. And then we'll come back here to the classroom and do some more practice working with sentences in Latin.